All right, children, welcome back. Right now, we're going to go over the FRQ that we did in class on Monday. All right, this is a banking balance sheets FRQ. Remember, the most important thing that you have to look at when you start these banking balance sheets every time, first thing you look for is your demand deposits, your checking accounts, and the reserve requirement ratio. Remember, everything else in the problem is predicated on those two things. Okay, so we have $100,000 in our demand deposit. Reserve requirement ratio is 10%. Number one, what is the dollar value of new loans that Taytay Bank can make? All right, so first thing we got to figure out, demand deposits is $100,000. In our reserves, we have $20,000. We have a 10% reserve requirement ratio. So first, we need to figure out what our required reserves are. And our required reserves are going to be that demand deposits of $100,000 times the reserve requirement ratio in decimal form. So times 0.2, and that's going to come out to our required reserves of $10,000. That's how much this bank is required to hold on to at any given time. Our excess reserves are anything above that. Our total reserves right now is $20,000. The bank is required to hold on to $10,000. That means that our excess reserves are $10,000 because we have $10,000 that is in the bank that does not have to be held on to, and this money can be loaned out. And so the way I would explain this is that we have $10,000 in excess reserves, and that's because we have $20,000 in our reserves, and the required reserves equal $10,000. And so we have $10,000 in excess reserves that may be loaned out. So for number two, if Taytay Bank loans out all of its excess reserves, that $10,000 we talked about before, calculate the maximum change in the money supply possible over time in the whole banking system. All right, so the money supply. First, we need to figure out our money multiplier. Our money multiplier is going to be, our formula is 1 over the RRR. Right now, that would be 1 over 0.1 because our reserve requirement ratio is 10%. So it's 1 over 0.1, and 10 cents goes into a dollar 10 times. Our money multiplier is 10. The amount of money that we can loan out is $10,000 because we can loan out anything that's in our excess reserves. So if we don't want to hold any excess reserves, we're going to loan out all $10,000. 10,000 times 10 is going to come out to $100,000. So the money supply can increase by up to $100,000. Remember, it'll increase by that much if everybody that takes out these loans keeps putting the money back in their own demand deposit accounts, and it gets loaned out over and over and over again. And all the banks want to loan out everything they can. Number three, if the Federal Reserve wants to increase aggregate demand, would they lower or increase the reserve requirement ratio? To increase aggregate demand, they would want to lower the reserve requirement ratio. Reserve requirement ratio because, that's explained, so I'm saying because, and that's because that lowering the reserve requirement ratio will allow banks to loan out more of people's demand deposits, of people's checking account. So that'll lead to an increase in the amount of money that can be loaned out. Ooh, I didn't mean to do that. Good gravy. More loans lead to more spending, equals more spending. And that'll be an increase in aggregate demand. So if you want aggregate demand to increase, you would need to lower the reserve requirement ratio. That makes it easier for banks to give out loans. That also leads to a higher money multiplier, which will lead to more spending. Money supply increases, people can spend more money. All right, aggregate demand then increases if people are spending. Let's look at number two. Number two, again, first thing we look at, demand deposits. We have $10,000 in demand deposits. Our reserve requirement ratio is 20%. Calculate the amount of money this bank has in excess reserves. So first, we need to figure out what required reserves are. All right, required reserves are going to be equal to 10,000 times 20%. So 10,000 times 0.2. And that is going to equal $2,000. So we have $2,000 in required reserves at this bank. Oops. All right, $2,000 in required reserves. So then excess reserves are going to be anything above that $2,000. We currently have $4,000 in our reserves period. $2,000 is required. That means that we have $2,000 in our excess reserves. So $2,000 above what we're required to hold. Assume Shahed comes into the bank and withdraws $2,000 from her checking account. When she takes $2,000 out of her checking account, it's going to come from two places. The first place it comes from is her checking account, so demand deposits. That's going to go from $10,000 to $8,000. The money that's in the demand deposit accounts is also the money that makes up our loans and our reserves. So the second place that comes from, that $2,000 is also coming out of the bank's reserves. This is the money that's actually sitting in the bank. So $2,000 is going to come out of here. It can't come from the loans because that money's already gone. You can't just call the people that took those loans in and be like, hey, we need the money back. I know we told you could take 5 years to pay us back, but we need it now, so bring it in. You can't take that money back. It's already gone. It has to come from the reserves. So after Shahed's withdrawal, the new value of total reserves at Taytay Bank is $2,000. So there was $4,000 in the reserves. Now she took $2,000 out. There's only $2,000 left. All right. What is the initial effect of the withdrawal in the M1 measure of money supply? There is no effect, or I should say initial effect on M1 money supply. It says explain, so we have to say because, and it's because M1 is made up of cash and checking accounts. And Shahed moved money from her checking account and put it in her pocket. Both of those places, both her checking account and her pocket, are part of the M1 measure of money supply. So nothing changed. The only thing that would have changed is if she maybe moved it into her savings account, because savings would be M2. Or maybe if she put it in a certificate of deposit, because that would be M2 also. All right, so as a result of the withdrawal, oops, let's get some space. As a result of the withdrawal, what is the new value of required reserves at Taytay Bank? So required reserves, let's see, required reserves equals, and now let's head over there and figure it out. So she took $2,000 out of her checking account. That means there's now $8,000 in her demand deposit account times the reserve requirement ratio of 20% times 0.2. And that means that our required reserves are going to be $1,600. So her bank is required to hold $1,600 now. Currently, they're holding $2,000. That's what we said a minute ago. She took $2,000 out, so the reserves went down to $2,000. So if they're currently holding $2,000, they're required to hold $1,600. That means that the new value of excess reserves is going to be equal to $400. Excess reserves equals $400. So again, there's $2,000 sitting in the reserves now. Her bank is required to hold on to $1,600. They're currently holding on to $2,000. They have $400 excess. With that money, they could loan it out.